Cool. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be talking today about how you can create a culture that builds your product for you, that grows itself. To begin, just a tiny bit more an introduction. So I'm Nilan. I've worked with early stage startups for the last 5-6 years. I like tequila, and some of those startups have been successful. Many have failed. One of them was TransferWise. Whoop. Hi, Gregory. So I met TransferWise. I got intro to the founders by a friend who said, these guys have got a great product, but they haven't got any customers. And it took a long while to get going, but eventually we did. And TransferWise, I'm responsible for product and marketing. So we're famous for our Estonian founders, evangelical customers, and the growth. And what I'm going to try and talk through today is the common thread between those three things, which is our culture. So we think of our culture, I think these words sum up our culture. Product is people. So every single person, if you think about it in your organization, works in some way on the customer experience, and in some way influences the experience that your customers will have. And hence, the product that your customers will experience is an outcome of the people that you hire. And there's this thing that's happened in the kind of corporate world where people kind of believe that people do within businesses what you tell them to do. And something very powerful happens when you break that myth. And you realize that people within your teams are free agents, and they only ever do what they want to do. And the most you can ever do is to try to create a culture that influences their decisions, and you do that by the way in which you behave. And this is a new emergent way of building product. Companies like Airbnb, Spotify, Valve, and us are all kind of playing with this in different ways. Some people call this holacracy, and there's been a couple of good books about it. I can't really talk about any of those other companies, and I can only talk about the experiences of the things that we've tried and what's worked and what hasn't worked. So how does product typically get built at a kind of large company? Well, a lot of this comes down to how does accountability work. So large businesses are owned by shareholders, and they need to generate a return. They want the business to grow. So they hire a CEO who says, hey, you know what? We're going to grow revenues 10% year on year, EBITDA. He actually doesn't know how to do that, but he's got a good spreadsheet, and he hires someone who says they can. And depending on your strategy, if you're like a product-led business or a marketing-led business or a sales-led business, you hire someone who says, I can grow the business by 10%. I've got a plan. But really, that planning is guessing. I think all of you here know that. And the people who really are going to figure out how to grow the business are the team. And the way they figure it out is by solving customer problems. But in this kind of structure, the kind of feedback loop between I've got a plan that says we're going to do this, and then team starts talking to customers and realizes the problem's all the way over here, it takes a long time to sort out. And you end up with a bunch of unhappy customers. So then let's talk about startups, because startups are different, aren't they? Because in startups, the shareholders are your founders, so we don't have these kind of external stakeholders. But startups are way more difficult, because at the beginning, you have no data. So founders really just start with conviction. So they have an idea, a vision from God. So God wakes them up one day and says, you know what? You've got to do peer-to-peer money transfer. And and no one, the fact that no one's done it yet means no one believes it's possible. And the greater the gulf between reality and the founder's belief is the greater the value that will be unlocked. So they got the vision, they now need to execute. They now need to persuade other people through force of their charisma or just through being an asshole to build that product. And having worked with a bunch of early stage companies, it's very, very painful watching that whole, God told me that people want this, and the data says, no, they don't, but you just keep going. And it's kind of like watching a mouse give birth to an elephant. Sorry, I had to put that slide in there somewhere. If they're successful and they get past that stage, they raise funding and they go hire one of these guys who then goes hires, does a plan, who then goes hires a team, and then you're just back where you started again. So is there an alternative? And so I think the key to the alternative is to try to devolve the decision-making from the exec team down to the team that actually interacts with customers, the team that can actually make a decision on the product and change the direction of the company. That's way harder than it sounds, and I'll spend some time talking through some of the things that worked well and haven't as we've tried to do that. Before I get to that, and just to give a little bit of context, I'll cover a little bit around how we've grown. Because we've grown because of our culture and because of our product. Also because at lunchtime, everyone asked me, you're going to talk through how you've grown, haven't you? I was like, yes. Okay. So the biggest driver of our growth to date has been evangelism. So 60% of our customers last month came to TransferWise because a friend told them about TransferWise. Last year, only 30% of our customers found out about TransferWise for a friend. Evangelism is the only scalable channel. So our customers know other people who could use TransferWise. If we continue to give them a great service, they will tell more people who will tell the world. Yep, we do advertising and we do stunts and Facebook and all that kind of good stuff, but that just amplifies the product. Without that, we would be nothing. Let's take this a little bit further. So we have a hypothesis that you can actually create evangelism. And this is one of the reasons why I joined the guys. It's quite a seductive idea to build a product that's so good that it grows itself. So how do you do it? You start off by really understanding why people recommend your product. So Net Promoter Score, I'm not going to stand up on stage and explain what Net Promoter Score is, but you guys know what it is. But really get underneath the skin of why people recommend your product. Through doing that and just listening really carefully, you kind of see there's broadly two sets of reasons why people recommend your product. So there's either a very rational set of reasons, like you've got to use TransferWise because it's cheap, or emotional ones. And what you see is when they're talking about the rational reasons, they're talking about the product. And when they're talking about the emotional stuff that had a connection with them, they're talking about your brand. So on the product side, something that I believe is every product's got these parameters around it that you can kind of measure them on. So for us in money transfer, it kind of took us a while, but our parameters are speed, price, convenience, and coverage. So you kind of hear this when our customers tell their friends in phrases like, you've got to use TransferWise because it's cheap. You've got to use TransferWise because it's really fast. You've got to use TransferWise because it's really easy to use. Now what we've learned through looking at that is that, so banks charge 5%. If we charged 4.8%, we may get a customer, but we would never get advocacy. But banks charge 5 and we charge 0.5. That means if you're transferring £1,000 a month, say, to pay for a mortgage in Spain, each time you'd save 50 quid. You do that for a couple of months, you've got £200 and you're going on holiday for not doing anything. That's worth talking about. So in order to drive word of mouth and evangelism, you need to aspire on your product KPIs to be an order of magnitude better than the alternative that's in the market. That is not easy to do. And more than that, you've got to do that because you believe that's the right thing to do, as opposed to that's some kind of clever growth hack. So let's dive on a little bit more into the brand side. And this is definitely stuff we're still very much figuring out. So we had this great product for our first 2 years, and we did not grow. So product is not enough, I learned. I kind of took away from that. And one of the guys who solved this was our first head of marketing. So I remember he likes to say, people do not talk about money transfer in the pub. So we need to give our customers stories to talk about. And at first, like as an angry young startup, you're just swearing. It's like, hey, talk about us. Or you're stripping in public. And that kind of stuff works. And it kind of gets a bit of buzz and a bit of you going. But over time, you'll start figuring out what you stand for and what you believe. And a turning point happened when we rebranded to our flag symbol. At that point, we sent out an email. It was actually this email to our entire customer base. And it just talked about the world we wanted to build. It didn't have any naked people in it or anything like that. And we acquired more customers from people forwarding this email on than any other route. So I think increasingly of TransferWise as a movement. And the things we try to dial up in our product is a sense of ownership, that people feel like they helped build TransferWise, and a sense of pride when they see us doing things in public. And we believe if you put these things together, kind of a product that is an order of magnitude better than the alternatives in the market, and you put together a sense of ownership and pride in your customer base, you get evangelism. So back to culture. How does this scale? So back to devolving decision-making to the teams. So we've now got these ideas of these things matter to us: speed, price, convenience, building a brand. How do we move on this as quickly as we can? How do we empower the teams to make decisions? So our flavor of this is what we call our autonomous teams. So we work in autonomous, independent teams that each work on different KPIs that make a difference to our customers and drive our growth. So let's take the currencies team. So just to talk through the way the product works. So say you want to send money from the UK to the US, you send money to our bank account in the UK, and then ours in the US pays out. As long as there's enough people going the other way, there's enough money here for that to happen for a fraction of the cost you expect from the bank, and very quickly. So all you need to launch a new currency is a bank account and to be regulated in the market. So we put a team on that, and we call that the currencies team. The currencies team is autonomous and independent. So autonomous. So that means nobody tells the currencies team what to do. So what does that mean? So last quarter, they launched Australian dollar and a basket of other currencies. There wasn't a group of wise men or a VP strategy that kind of sat down and said, this is what we need to launch next. It was a team that works on launching currencies. They're able to look at the market data. They're able to make decisions on where we believe we would get the most volume through expanding our product into. For that to really work, the team also needs to be independent. It needs to have everything within it that it needs in order to launch a currency. So it has bankers, well, ex-bankers, lawyers, engineers, product people, and UX folk. So here's a flavor of the other teams, just to give you a feel for how the whole thing stacks together. There's an operations team, picks up money in one country, pays it out, looks at KPIs as speed and cost. A team on kind of making the verification experience as slick as possible. A team on converting customers. A team on reducing customers' worry through the experience. A team on viral growth. A team on marketing. So you kind of got this feeling of these teams all running independently now, each trying to understand, how do I move this KPI that changes it, that helps us change and understand better our customers' behavior, that enables us to grow. So how does the culture support this? And what the fuck is culture anyway? So I don't know. So I think of it as these three things. A shared set of values, kind of the processes and structures that are within the organization, and the behaviors that we've learnt to encourage. So for the remainder, I'm just going to step through each of these. I'll start off with values. So we got great values, kind of proud of our values. And we do kind of hire to them, like there's stuff in there like, customers are more important than your team, are more important than your ego. Stuff like we get it done. And what this does is you can kind of imagine that if everyone's got a shared set of values, then there are less arguments about which decision to make. Especially if you've got a set of kind of brand principles as well, like charge as little as possible. So if everyone kind of buys into that, as that's effectively our pricing strategy there for when we get to global scale, and everyone kind of understands the rationale for why we do that, or why transparency and fairness are important and why we stand for that, then there's less decisions that need to be escalated up for somebody to arbitrate, because the teams are more than capable of working this out between themselves. But I remember talking this through with my friend Ian, the founder of Songkick, and he said, that's just common sense. He goes, startups have got this tendency of like, we've rediscovered like something absolutely incredible with our values. It's like, you just told me you look after your customers. It's like, oh my God, that's like the most obvious thing ever. So yeah, values do play a role, but they're not, I think, as important as sometimes we like to think they are. So then it's got to be about the process. And product managers love process. Let's talk through some of our processes. Let's talk through cadence. So cadence, for me, is like the drumbeat of the business. And our drumbeat is quarterly. And so much like most of you, we run a quarterly planning process where each of the teams sits down within their team and says, this quarter, we want to make this change for our customers. And we believe we will have this kind of impact in terms of how our KPI would move. And this is kind of the first sprint against that. And then every month, they kind of report progress in an all-hands meeting. And that kind of works well, but I don't think that's too dissimilar to top-down organizations either. Something that is a little bit different is what we call weak product ownership. So every part of our product is owned by each of the teams. You can imagine the conversion team owns the conversion funnel, the virality team owns the refer a friend page. But any team can change any part of the product. And the way to think about this is each team is kind of working on a feedback loop from customers, trying to understand a little bit more around what are the problems we need to solve to take this change to the world. And some of these feedback loops overlap, and we need to figure a way to get those overlaps to work. And those overlaps don't get resolved by somebody making a decision, it gets resolved by the people within the teams making a decision. So this all came from like the great Mexican standoff between marketing and product, right? So I basically have got so tired of working in startups and organizations where the product team says the marketing's fucked, and the marketing team says the product's fucked. So I was like, we're going to stop this. And the way we stopped it was by putting a product team into marketing and telling them they could change anything. I love the way there's like a sharp intake of breath from the entire audience. And it's fine as long as they're moving their KPI and they can measure it and they can talk through the impact, because there was something you were missing and not understanding in product as they did that. And it's fine because it drives the right kinds of conversations to happen within the teams, and it helps you move faster. So let's talk a little through cross-team disciplines as well. So this is relatively new. We've only really been doing this for about 6 months to 9 months. So obviously, so within our teams, you'll have designers, you'll have data scientists, product managers, and engineers. And each of them also obviously belong to part of a larger team across the organization. The hard reporting lines definitely feels like your ownership is within the team, but every time an engineer checks in code into our code base, they're accountable to every other engineer in the business. And so these cross teams have their own sets of KPIs. The design team is trying to create a more consistent, coherent framework that aligns with our vision. The engineering team is trying to reduce our cycle time. And our product team thinks hard about our roadmap and where we're going. But they don't have, none of these teams have their 20% time to go hack on their own stuff. The engineers need to be able to articulate to their teams why this stuff is important and why they need to refactor the code and why we need to improve our cycle time. So that there's very little centralization and central teams. But what about country teams? How does that work? So we're a global business with offices in 5 countries now and scaling globally. How does that dimension work? Surely we must have a matrix. Well, it turns out we don't have a globally scalable product. And what I mean by that is you just, when we enter a market, it's not that we turn on marketing and it goes boom. We turn on marketing and nothing happens usually. And we discover this most acutely in the US because Americans don't know how to do a wire transfer. And it's not their fault, it's because their banks don't really know how to help them do a wire transfer. So wire transfers, which is what our entire product is built on, isn't a very widely used product in America, and it's actually very expensive to do a domestic wire. So you can imagine that we'd start off with a US team, spin it up, you put a couple of marketing people in it, a little bit of product marketing, and you tell them to go launch the market. And they come back and they tell you, our NPS sucks, no one wants to use us, no one wants to talk about us, we're going to have to change the product. And what would normally happen is a giant bun fight with the central team, but really what happened was they just hired whatever they needed into the team in order to change the product. If they needed to change the back end, they pulled the back end engineers in. If they needed to review the verification process, they rebuilt that. They did whatever they needed to do to get that product to work for the market. And so we don't have this org chart with a bunch of empty roles for country teams with different functions within the country, because none of us have a clue what functions we need within which country, because we don't know what the problems we'd need to solve are. But we try to create the fluidity within the org to enable the organization to solve the problems. So finally, on to behaviors. And these are more learnings, things that we've kind of observed and thought, and things that we've decided to encourage, and things we've also decided to discourage. One of my favorite ones is product managers and the ego. So I've had the privilege of interviewing and meeting lots of product managers, and one of the challenges that product managers face is having been the product management industry within most corporates involves not only focusing on customer problems and developing solutions iteratively, but also stakeholder management. Also kind of being able to work across team, also being able to, almost like a founder, have your own sense of conviction around this is the solution that the world needs to see. And that's really dangerous, especially in a startup environment, because what happens is you end up building the wrong product. You build a product that your boss wants to see, or build a product that you think will make you look good in the eyes of X, Y, Z. And so we have found a very simple way of working around this, which is that a simple rule, that product managers cannot tell engineers what to do. Because fundamentally, if you cannot inspire an engineer to work with you on product, then you're going to struggle to inspire customers as well. Another thing we spend time on is understanding the kind of maturity model in the teams. So I'd say up to 6 months ago, 60% of our teams were failing. And to be fair, that's no different to anywhere else I've ever worked. It kind of makes you think, all this stuff I've been talking through, it's a load of kind of Kool-Aid, but it doesn't actually make a difference. So let's just talk through a bit about what a failing team means. So there's a definite maturity model against teams. At one end of the spectrum, when teams are starting out, it's very much, what is the problem we're trying to solve? How do we know whether we've solved it? And you see them going through this period of high ambiguity in trying to figure out, to zoom in on a problem and figure out a KPI that will help them know if they've solved it successfully. After a while, they get to being able to measure the KPI, and then this massive jump happens when they figured out how to move it. They've had an insight that's enabled them to unlocked something. They've learned something about our customers which we didn't know before, and they were able to use product to leverage that. And if they've managed to do all of that, then they get to develop a vision of where they think the product will be going in the next 12 months. The cool thing is you can kind of see in this way that we've helped teams move along this. And quite crucially has been our approach to talent in this. So in most organizations, the way you kind of think about talent is you have an org chart and you have a bunch of empty boxes, and then you go around bitching about why you can't hire people. And really the way I think to think about it is more around you've attracted this talent within your organization today. You need to create a culture that enables them to flow to where they can have an impact, rather than let them keep banging their head against the wall again and again. So finally, in closing, I'll talk through some of the stuff we haven't worked out and some of the kind of conscious decisions that we've made. So in operating this way, you definitely lose things like consistency. Like you can imagine our account page doesn't look like our conversion page, doesn't look like our XYZ. And yep, it's definitely true. Our design team is constantly wincing when they look at our product. You lose efficiency, because you can imagine if our engineering teams all worked in exactly the same way, our cost base would be lower on that side. You'd lose singularity of vision. You'd also lose kind of swiftness in which you need to make a decision sometimes. What you gain on the flip side is incredible ownership and empowerment. The stuff we haven't quite worked through yet is how does accountability really work? We're trying to encourage teams to feel accountable to their peers, but they always feel slightly more accountable to the founders, and that still has kind of dysfunction that you'd imagine it does. Dealing with failure. So how do you know if a team's failing? Is it really just not trying hard enough, or is it working on the wrong problem? It's definitely an area we've not helped our teams figure out. And when should you intervene? Intervening is kind of the most damaging thing you could ever do to a team, because it's kind of telling the team it's not going to solve that problem on its own. Yeah, these problems I think are there in whether you're operating this way or you're operating in any kind of context. So why do we work this way? So working this way is definitely the only way we manage to scale our headcount the way we have, which has enabled us to grow. Because fundamentally, we grow at the rate at which you solve problems. And that's the rate at which you attract and develop talent. And the prize for doing this, I don't think there's any accident that each of these businesses up here is trying to disrupt an industry that's been around for hundreds of years. And in fact, one scary thought I realized about 6 months ago is a bank could launch their equivalent of TransferWise tomorrow. And they could do it, but they've chosen not to. And they've chosen not to because of their values and because of what they stand for and because of how they make money. And what we're trying to do is trying to rebuild an industry from a completely different value set, from customers upwards. And that's really, really hard. And the only way I think we've got a chance of making that happen is with these empowered teams. So yeah, product equals people, and that's me, Dan. Thank you very much.